Hello everyone, I'm Alvina. I hope you guys have seen my previous video, my first video that I ever uploaded on this YouTube channel. So like in this video I will actually be explaining one of the chapters from the IGCSE biology workbook. It's the 3rd edition if I'm not mistaken, but I'll mention it in the description box below which workbook am I actually referring to. So I'm not really going in the chronological order. Well, I significantly think that I wanted to start with a random chapter from the book so that you guys have a proper idea of how the questions are like in the later chapters, as I actually noticed one thing that in this workbook the difficulty of the questions is actually kind of harder compared to the past paper questions. So if you guys know how to master these, then it's wonderful actually. So yeah, and this video is actually for those people who are actually willing to understand the questions from this workbook, how you have to answer them, the way of answering, the answering style. So it's basically more emphasized on that actually. Besides that, I was also a student, and I'm still a student actually, but I completed my IGCSE, so I actually know that the resources for this workbook, it's not available that much online due to some issues actually. So I thought of like recording this and explaining the answers to the questions, and yeah, so let's begin. It's kind of about to rain in my area, but that's fine. So okay, so this is the chapter 16 of this workbook. It's about reproduction in plants. If I'm not mistaken, in the latest syllabus, reproduction in plants and reproduction in humans is actually combined, both of the chapters, so don't confuse on that actually. So chapter number 16, so these are like the important definitions you have to learn, and these are still included in your syllabus. The first one is asexual reproduction, a process resulting in the production of genetically identical offspring from one parent. And the next one, which is sexual reproduction, it's a process involving the fusion of the nuclei of two gametes to form a zygote. Gamete, which are referring to the sex cells, the male and the female ones, the egg and the sperm, to form a zygote, and the production of the offspring from those egg and sperm. And that offspring is obviously genetically identical from each other. Next definition, fertilization, the fusion of gamete nuclei. It's when the egg and the sperm, they fertilize. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant. Self-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower of the same plant. Don't confuse it. Self-pollination, it's always of the same plant. Yeah. And it's within the same plant, of course. And the final definition is cross-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower on a different plant of the same species. So you guys need to bear in mind when they talk about cross-pollination, the pollination is supposed to be within the same species of flower. For example, one species of flower is probably rose, and the second species of flower is berries. And cross-pollination cannot happen between these two species because they are not the same species. Rose and berry are totally two different species, so cross-pollination cannot happen. But cross-pollination can happen within the same species of rose or within the same species of berry. So this is an example I'm giving you guys. So yeah, I actually wanted to give you guys, want to note to you that you remember previously I said about the sexual reproduction involving the sperm and the egg cells. Actually, for this chapter, since it's about plants, it's mainly about the pollen and the ovules that are taking part in the fertilization. And yeah, so let's move on to the first question, which is exercise 16.1, grass pollen. So let's read the question together so that you guys can have a good understanding. So in one part of this exercise, links are made between two different parts of the syllabus: reproduction in plants and the way in which the human body fights infectious disease. Students often find it tricky to move from thinking about one topic to thinking about another in the same question, but there's really no problem as long as you recognize that you need to refer to ideas that you might not have linked together before. So basically, for the exercise questions for this chapter, this long text, basically it means in short words that the questions from this exercise of this chapter, it involves the reproduction chapter from the plants, as well as the infection chapter, the pathogen chapter. Actually, if I'm not, I think chapter 10 or 11. I think chapter 10 for the pathogen chapter. It's not called the pathogen chapter, but that's how I remember my memory. But it's actually chapter 10. Yeah. So let's move on to the first part of the question. Creeping bent grass, like almost all grass, is wind pollinated. So when they talk about wind pollinated, you guys must understand wind pollinated flowers, they don't need an agent to transfer. They're highly reliant on wind, as by the name is wind pollinated. It's dull. It does not have a very sweet nectar. It doesn't have like spiky pollens, and the anther always hangs outside of the flower. And and it's all the pollen grains are usually light, so that it's easily carried away by the wind. So these are like the important features you guys must be remembering when it's talking about wind pollinated. So the graph shows the quantity of pollen emitted by creeping bent grass at different times of the day for 3 days in July. Describe how pollen emission from creeping bent grass varies during the day. So the graph that they're actually talking about, they're actually referring to this graph over here. This is the graph, number of the pollen grains per meter cube of the air, and the time of the day. So as you can see, these are the 3 different types of lines, and you must refer to this key over here. So it's 8 July, number of pollen grains, it went like from 0 until it went up to between I should say around 9,000. It reached the peak on 8 July, and then it started to decrease as the time passed. So what you can conclude is that the timing for the pollen grains, it was basically during midday when there's bright light, as you can see, between 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. So yeah, and then the next part is 3rd July. I know you guys can't really see properly as it's actually all black and white, there are not much colors, but I'll actually just say it out. So this is like the 3rd July part. So as you can see, it increases steadily, and then it just has like a high fluctuation, and then it just dramatically drops down, and it increases again and goes down. So it's like very fluctuative kind of pollen grains on the 3rd of July. And then on the 25th of June, which is this one, this has like the highest pollen grains. So if you all notice, all these 3 lines basically indicates that during this time of the day, the number of the pollen grains was actually the highest. And yeah, it moves downwards. So now, describe how pollen emission from creeping bent grass varies during the day. So you can see that there's little or no pollen is emitted at night, between about 22 and 7 hours. I forgot to put a full stop. Pollen emission rises sharply during the morning, peaking at around 11 hours, then falling sharply to 15 hours, then remaining low during the late afternoon and evening. So as you can see, the question is asking for 3 days, meaning they're referring to 8 July, 3rd July, and 25th of June actually. So that means you need to describe the pollen emission overall from this outlook mainly. So you can say there's little or no pollens emitted at night. So you can see over here, this is the midnight from 12 a.m. until 7 a.m. It's totally dark and there's no emission of pollen grains. And then between 22 and 7 hours, pollen emission rises sharply during the morning, peaking at around 11 hours and falling sharply to 15 hours, then remaining low during the late afternoon evening. So it rises sharply during this 7-11 hours, and then it peaks slowly, and it peaks again at 1500 hours, but it's still not that fluctuative. So with this kind of question, you can actually expect at about 2 marks. And yeah, so this is about like 2 marks question, you could say. Yeah, this is about like 2 marks question actually. So because the first one they're asking about whether about the pollen grain emission during the night and during the daytime. So you say there's little or no pollen emitted at night, and then you say about the time. So remember, when it's any question related to the graph, any figure or any explanation you guys need to explain from the graph, always use these figures in the graph. Always use the values from the x-axis and the y-axis and describe the graph, whether it's fluctuative, whether it's decreasing, whether it's increasing steadily, is it constant. So these are like the important terms you have to remember when you have to describe a graph. And yeah, and then the second part of the answer is pollen emission rises sharply. This one you have to describe the graph, you have to explain. So remember, there are 2 important keywords. One is describe, another is explain. When they're asking about describe, as in this question, describe how pollen emission from creeping bangers varies in the day. So when it's about describing, so you have to literally just tell everything. What do you see on the graph? So when they ask about describe, you explain, you basically mention everything. What do you see on the graph over here? But if the question is about explaining the graph, then you do not mention, you can just mention one keyword from the graph. But when the keyword of the question is explain, okay, when it's explain, then you have to describe the theory behind the thing. You don't mention about the structure of the graph, like how it is actually. But since the question is asking about describe, so you guys only have to explain how the whole thing works in the graph, like from this time to the day, from this time there is no pollen emission, then from here it fluctuates very steep, and then it slows down during this time of the day. And yeah, so this is how you explain. This is one tip that I'm giving you as well. So now this is basically from this. So part A is over actually. So okay, so part A is over, so let's just highlight this, and now let's go to the next question, which is part B. Okay, so from the pairs of the descriptions below, circle the one in each pair that you would expect to describe creeping bent grass flowers and their pollen. So this question is basically referring to wind pollinated. So this creeping bent grass is the wind pollinated. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, they are always dull. This is the first one. Anthers dangling outside the flower. It is always hanging outside the flower for a high chance of pollination by the wind. And then the feathered stigma outside the flower as well, and large quantities of pollen, and they are light. Yeah. So now this is actually very simple. There's not much explanation for this. You just have to remember these features of wind pollinated flower. They mainly ask in your paper 4 theory. They usually ask like 1 or 2 features, or sometimes rarely in MCQ actually. So now part C of it. So let's highlight part B. We're over. Now part C. Many people are allergic to pollen. When they breathe in pollen grains, their immune system overreacts as though the pollen grains are pathogens. This can cause various symptoms, including watery and itchy eyes and a sore and runny nose. This is often called hay fever. So remember now in this question, if you realize earlier over here they said in this part of the box that they're going to combine both the reproduction part as well as the pathogen chapter actually. So now they want you to combine this actually, since this reproduction chapter comes after the pathogen chapter. So the question, the examiner expects you to obviously know what are the things from the previous chapter, as your concept must be cleared obviously. So now it's very simple. Explain the meaning of these terms: pathogen, an organism that causes a disease, or you can say a disease causing organism. Immune system, the white blood cells, which are literally the lymphocytes, they defend the body against disease, and lymphocytes produce specific antibodies to destroy antigens. So looking at this question, you can just say it's like 1 mark each. So so this is, you could expect like this is 1 mark, and over here the and over here that I mentioned, it's actually not necessary, but if you want additional information, and it's obviously important for syllabus, but according to this question you just need like a 1 mark explanation. So the white blood defend the body against disease, this is enough. Or you can say lymphocytes if you want to add an aid, like to connect, you can do it. It's better to connect as it's easier for the examiner, or it's easier for your teacher to understand, and it doesn't leave your answer like a cliffhanger. I know what, I guess what you, I hope you guys know what I mean. So this is like a better answer for the definition of an immune system: white blood cells that defend the body against disease, and lymphocytes produce. Okay, so lymphocytes are basically the one that has, yeah, right, yeah. So yeah, the white blood cells that defend the body. So actually, if you guys, white blood cells include both lymphocytes and phagocytes. Phagocytes are the one that involve in engulfing, and lymphocytes are the one that actually produce the antibodies to destroy the antigens that are present on the pathogen actually. So you must know the differences between these two. Don't confuse. They're really simple to understand, but yeah, it takes time. Now we're done with these two parts. Sorry, give me a second. Right, so we're done with this. Now suggest why pollen from wind pollinated flowers such as creeping bent grass is more likely to cause hay fever than pollen from insect pollinated flowers. Okay, now look at the explanation. There is much more of it, and it is more easily carried in the air, so it can be breathed in. So you know this whole thing, this creeping, I'm sorry for the background sound. I actually live next to a highway, so it's always noisy, so yeah. So sorry for the distraction, but in this question they're referring to creeping bent grass. If you guys get confused, I just got that creeping bent grass, and you can just write down their wind pollinated flower, so it's easier for you to understand in simple English language. So basically, why pollen from wind pollinated flowers are more likely to cause hay fever than pollen from it. So when it's wind pollinated, you guys must understand it must come directly, that it's always carried in the air. So when it is carried in the air, it can be breathed very easily by the human beings, and thus it can cause hay fever to human beings. And because it's wind pollinated, remember over here in this question you have to like circle the right features of wind pollinated. They're always in large quantities. So when it's in large quantities, there is plus they're carrying the air, so it's easily breathed by the human being, so it can cause hay fever. So this is how you explain, and this question is actually worth at least 3 marks, although it looks like a 1 sentence, but I mean that's how the mark scheme works. It's worth 3 marks actually. So because they're asking you why, so if they're asking you why, then you must understand that they want you to explain the whole concept thing from this wind pollinated thing. So if it's wind pollen, you basically link the features together. So there's much more of it. You don't necessarily have to write like this, as long as the answers correlate or they're somehow similar like this, it's still correct. All the mark schemes are actually very specific, but not, it's still acceptable in this case, like even if I write no one words. So in this way you can say, since there are large quantities of pollen in the creeping bent grass, so it is more easily carried in the air, so it can be easily breathed by the human beings, thus causing hay fever. So it's almost worth 3 marks. So yeah. So I'll just mention here 3 marks. Alright, so now we are done with this part of the question. So yeah, we're done with part C as well, and let's go on to the next part, which is this one. So now exercise 16.2, pollination in forests of different shapes and sizes. So this exercise presents the results of some research relating to deforestation. Although this is not covered until chapter 21, you probably know a little about it already and will be able to make some sensible suggestions when answering question D. You will also need to draw conclusions and think about planning a further investigation. So basically they are actually asking a question from the deforestation chapter, which is literally almost one of the last chapters of the biology syllabus, but it's very sensible. You guys know what this deforestation, like, you know, cutting down of trees illegally or like burning of trees, exactly. So now let's read the question together. So now, from all over the world, forests are actually being cut down and destroyed. Small patches are often left behind, and research is being carried out to see how the shape and size of these patches affects the animals and plants that live in them. One piece of research looked at the pollination of holy flowers by butterflies in 3 different areas of forest. The areas were A set of patches of forest all connected to each other by long, narrow tree-covered areas. B, a set of patches of forest the same size as A but not connected. And area C, a set of smaller patches of forest but not connected. The butterflies that pollinated the holy flowers were known to spend most of their time at the edges of the forest, rarely penetrating into deep forest for very long. The researchers inspected samples of holy flowers in each forest area and counted the number of ovaries that were turning into fruits. They then calculated the mean number of fruits per flower in each area. The graph shows the results. So you can see mean number of fruits per flower, area A, area B, area C. So you can see area A is the highest, and then area C is the second highest, right? So now describe. So as I said, always remember this one tip I'm giving you guys. If the question asks about describe the results or describe specifically, you guys literally only have to explain the things that you see in the graph. You don't have to use any theory knowledge for this. You only have to use information from the graph, and sometimes you need to use relevant information from the text given here to connect with the answers, and obviously use values from the x-axis and y-axis to gain the data marks. So yeah, let's read it together. So the results are the most fruits per flower were produced in area A. As you can see, these are the highest mean number of fruits in area A. The set of patches of forest that were connected to each of the corridors. So you see the set of patches, you basically use this this information from here to connect your answer. Oh my god, this is not the way it's supposed to be, but like there's something wrong, but I guess I'm trying to cover it up. But yeah, you guys have to basically use this. You can use this, or you can shorten it down to connect to answer with this. Here there was an average of 0.5 fruits per flower. So I actually don't think I think I can zoom in. Yeah, I can zoom it in. So as you can see, this is 0.4, 0.6, and this line of this bar chart of this bar is actually in the middle, so it's obviously 0.5, common sense, right? So yeah, so 0.5 fruits per flower. The least fruits per flower developed in the set of unconnected forest patches, which is area B. Area B, where is area B? Wait 1 second. In area B, so this is like the least, so but not connected, okay. And the set of smaller patches of forest came in between area C. So basically what you guys can conclude from this is that you can see area B has like the highest number of mean fruits per flower, so you just say the most fruits per flower produced in area A, then use this to connect the answer, and then you say how much number, since it's not given there, you have to estimate, which is really simple. So it's 0.5, mentioned is 0.5. This is like the data marks that they look at in your answer actually. And then the least fruit per flower, which is area B, you guys can mention, which is 0.3 actually, which is actually not necessary, but you can if you want to be on the safer side, which is about like 0.3 fruits per flower in area B, and that is because it developed in the set of unconnected forest patches, which is again a set of patches of forest in the same size but not connected. Alright, and then a set of smaller patches of forest came in between area C. So basically the highest is area A, the smallest area B, and in between area C. So you can coordinate this. So when they ask what the graph, you might, especially if it's a bar chart, and if it's like just these three bars, then you must include the explanation from these, including all of this. You can't just include this is the highest, this is the lowest. You must include all of this. But if it's like, for example, you have like 5-6 bars, or like 6-7 bars in a bar chart, then you can just say this is the highest, this is the lowest, and in between you can just somehow estimate between those bars. But since it's just 3 bars, the examiner expects you to mention all of this actually. So this is almost worth 3 marks, but 2 to 3 marks, it depends actually. I'll just mention it for reference. And yeah, this is almost 2 to 3 marks. It can vary actually. So use your own knowledge to outline what happens in a flower after it's pollinated in order to form a fruit. So this is actually a very simple question. So sometimes, you know, the question can be rephrased in such a way. Sometimes the question can be rephrased in such a way that they can ask you like this: explain from the results shown in the graph. Exactly. And it's sometimes very clueless, but then in reality they're actually asking, explain about the pollination or some, especially if they're asking about the term explain in the question, then you must know it's somewhat related to the pollination. Okay, but since it clearly mentioned here, it's really easy for you guys. Use your own knowledge. So you can just say pollination leaves the pollen grains on the stigma. Okay, the grains then grow pollen tubes down through the style, making the pollen tube. The male nuclei, which is the gametes, or you can say which is the pollen in this case, travel down the tubes into the ovule, where a male nucleus fuses with the female nucleus, which is the ovule, to produce a zygote. This zygote then develops into an embryo plant inside a seed. The ovary becomes a fruit. So this is how you explain. You looking at the number of lines given to you, the maximum ask you about like 3 marks actually. So I think it's pretty easy for you to understand. Basically, you know, if you guys don't understand it this way, then they actually you can like on Google, when you just type down the pollination of flowers, or I'll just show it to you guys over here. Give me a second. Okay, so as you can see, I'm now on Google over here. So you can see this is the stigma. I mean, if I try to click on the picture, I mean, I'm not able to move the screen due to some issues actually. But just for a reference, you can see in this picture, which is more clearer, this is the stigma. Sorry. Yeah, this is the stigma. This is like the style, and this is like the ovary thing. Okay, this is a very simple structure. It's not the detail actually, but you can say the pollen lands in the stigma over here from the anther via some agent actually, or via wind pollination, and then it lands on the stigma over here, and then a pollen tube is grown through the style down, and then it reaches to the ovary part, which is where the ovules are located, which is the sex cells, the female egg cells, and then from there the pollen, which is like the male nuclei, it fuses with the female nuclei over here, and then it forms a zygote, and then that zygote actually develops back into that zygote develops into an embryo plant inside a seed, and the ovary, which is like the hard part, actually becomes a fruit. So it's actually very simple. If you guys can understand the structure of the flower by just simply looking at the flower structure, how the process happens from here down over here, and then it eventually becomes a fruit, it's actually very easy for you guys to answer this question. Okay, so now let's look at the last part of this exercise. Give me a second, I forgot to highlight this. So we are done with part A. We are done with part A, and we are done with part B. Now we go to part C. So right, so using the information in the introduction to this exercise, such as explanation for the results obtained. Now they're asking you about to explain from the bar chart given below. They want you to explain from the bar chart given below. So you can just say fruits will only develop after, I'm sorry for the, I just have lots of spaces in between actually, sorry for that. So fruits will only develop after a flower has been pollinated. Okay, this is done by butterflies that prefer the edges of forests. So flowers near the edges of forests are more likely to produce fruits than ones deep inside. Okay, the small patches of forest had larger edge to volume ratio than the large patches, and the patches joined by corridors had even more edges. So basically they want you to mention that how this whole thing happened, like from this bar chart over here, they want you to explain that what the whole thing is going on here. So as you know, it's mainly about pollination, so you guys should have this straight into your mind that in pollination it must happen by an agent actually. So in this case it's the butterflies who are acting as the agent, so they prefer the edges of the forest. Okay, so you need to understand fruits will only develop after flowers pollinate. Pollinated happens when an agent transfers the pollen from the anther to the stigma. So butterflies prefer the edges of forest, so flowers in the edge of forest are more likely to produce fruits than the ones deep inside, because butterflies, they don't go deep inside. So the flower on the edges, they are more likely to produce more fruits, so more butterflies tend to stay on the edges of the edges of the forest. So the small patch of the forest had a larger edge to volume ratio, like larger edge to volume ratio, meaning there's larger surface for, or you can see if there's larger edges on the forest, so there'll be larger volume of the butterflies who tend to do the pollination process among the flowers. So that's why there are actually more flowers on the edges than the large patches which are actually deep inside, and the patches join corridors and even more edges. So basically over here they want you to correlate between area A, area B, area C. So you know area A had patches connected, area B had the same size of patch area A but not connected, and area C had smaller patches than area A and area C, but again they were not connected. So in the answers you can understand from here is that, so flowers near the edges of the forest were more likely to produce fruits, and the small patches of forest had a larger edge to volume ratio, meaning the smaller patches, which is technically you could say area C, they actually had larger edge volume than the large patches, which is in area A and area B, and the patches joined by corridors had even more edges joined by corridors, which were actually area A. So this is how you have to correlate it actually. And this term larger edge to volume ratio is specifically important for this part actually, where they want you, this is actually a very important term when answering questions related to explaining the bar explaining the things that's going on in the bar chart. So now let's move on to the next question, which is now in part C. Now let's move on to part D. I'll zoom it out a bit so it fits over here. So it is more likely that your suggested reasons are not actually proved by these results. Suggest how the researchers could modify their original experiment to test one of its suggestions more fully and reliably. So there are actually many different suggestions students could put forward. For example, researchers could make different patches of forest that were all identical in volume, meaning you have to keep the volume the same. Volume must be kept the same, and the independent variable in this investigation is the different patches of forest, and the constant variable is the must be all equal in volume law, but had different lengths of forest, okay, but had different lengths of edges, and compare the mean number of fruits per flower. So this is like the dependent variable, the one that is resulting from this. So since it's asking to test one of your suggestions more reliably and carefully, so you could just say could make different patches of forest that were all identical in volume but had different patches of forest, meaning you have different patches. For example, you only have like one patch of area A, one patch of area B, one patch of area C. This is not enough for investigation to be reliable. So now they're asking reliable, you must have more patches of these three areas, more in number, and the size of the patches must be not size of the patches, but like the number. For example, if area A had like 5 patches, then area B should have 5 patches, area C should have 5 patches. That is what they mean by identical in volume. And now we're here asking, but had different lengths of edges, meaning lengths of the edges are the one that you need to measure. You need to observe that the butterflies are the one that are going to be responsible for the pollination process. So as the edges are going to be the one to determine whether or not the butterflies are actually going to go into the forest, and then the outcome is actually going to be compared, and then you can see that the experiment is more reliable. Okay, so now the final part of the question is part E. It could be, it could be argued that this research suggests it is better to leave small patches of forest rather than large ones. However, most conservationists would say that this is not correct. With reference to this research and using your own thoughts about the importance of forest, discuss 2 points of view. So actually this part of this last question is actually referring to the last, like I think this the second last, which is like the deforestation chapter 21. So since you guys may have not learned that, but I'll just explain to you guys. It does appear that many small patches of forest are actually better than a few big ones, but this is unusual because these particular butterflies happen to need forest edges. There will be many more animals and plants that need large areas of deep forest to survive, and they will do better in large patches, preferably connected. Some animals need large territories. In order to hunt. Some only need small areas, but there needs to be a large population to be sure, so that they do not become extinct. And you guys can also include other points, such as referring to the importance of the carbon cycle and the production of oxygen. And the carbon cycle thing is also in the later chapters. You guys have not learned that yet probably. So, and this is the production, and in the production of oxygen, actually, like how oxygen is important for the survival of the organisms, the forests, and the carbon dioxide thing as well. So this one, it's more of like a very analogical thinking actually, but this kind of question that they ask you right here, they will never ever ask you this level of difficulty in the past paper. You guarantee my words it will never, because I have practiced a lot of past papers, but this level of difficulty does not come at all, because this one they're literally asking you to think externally out of the box, which cannot happen in the examination because you don't have that much time. It's just 1 hour 15 minutes for your paper for theory actually. So there are actually questions where you have to write 5-6 marks, but not at this much analogical thinking that is required actually. So for for this question, this is how the answer is supposed to be written, and you can just say that butterflies, basically from the whole thing that you can conclude is that butterflies, they need like edges of the forest, but other animals, they need the deeper forests. So if you make smaller patches of deeper forest and large patches of the edges, so that will actually affect the ecosystem. Actually, it does actually affect the ecosystem. So that is why everything must be balanced, and there must be a large population so that they don't become extinct actually. So a lot of investigation and experiments must be done to ensure that no species or no organisms are actually being harmed by making one patch small, one patch big actually. So this is how it is, and that's the end of our chapter 16 answer to the IGCSE biology workbook. So if you guys need any clarification, or you guys think that I explained something wrong, you guys can mention it in the comment box in the comment section below, so that I'm aware of it. And if I think that if it's deemed necessary, then for sure I'll pin your comment so that it's on the top and other people can see if I've done any mistakes and you guys have spotted out. So that's a great thing. So till then, stay tuned. And yeah, this is like the first chapter, literally not the first chapter, it's chapter 16, but it's like my first video. So yeah, right, see you then.